Hi, my name is David Boze. I am the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center, and it's great for you to join us this afternoon. And thanks so much for making the time. We're a little bit delayed because of some technical difficulties in getting our special guest on the line, but we've reached a workaround, and I think that'll satisfy everybody, and we'll be able to proceed with the presentation. The way it's going to work today is I'll start by speaking briefly with our Cole Center for Transportation Director, Maria Frost, about how the study started. She'll introduce our guest, the author of the study on the state's report on the ultra high-speed ground transportation project. And then he will give a PowerPoint presentation of the study and his findings, and then we'll do a Q&A after that. If you have questions for him at any point during this presentation, there's a question toolbox right there on your GoToWebinar screen, usually on the right-hand side of your screen. Just enter your question there. I'll assemble all of those questions. If you're media and you want to make a note of what your publication is, I'll prioritize your question because I want to make sure that you have the availability and are able to get all your questions answered. And then feel free, if you have a follow-up, to enter that in as well. So with that, let's get started. Let me bring Maria Frost on right now. And Maria, why don't you just tell us briefly how the study came about and your expectations for the piece.
Thanks, Dave. So we are really excited to have Tom with us today, and that he was able to complete this incredible study for Washington Policy Center. Though high-speed rail seems like an obviously bad idea in Washington, given past experience with mega projects in our state and failed high-speed rail projects elsewhere in our country, not to mention the changes we're seeing in travel and work that require flexible rather than fixed mobility solutions and options. Despite all of these things, developing a high-speed rail corridor remains a key priority for the governor's office going into the next session. So this is very relevant, very timely. And so Tom has studied these issues for years, and he brings a wealth of knowledge to this important debate. He has over 4 decades of experience as a senior executive in large transit organizations and as a consultant, auditor, and author. After founding and growing the transit industry practice of what is now Deloitte and growing it to the largest in the accounting industry, he was the chief financial officer of the Southern California Rapid Transit District, now part of Los Angeles Metro, and the 3rd largest transit operating in the US. He served well over 100 transit agencies, metropolitan planning organizations, federal and state departments of transportation, and equipment suppliers and contractors. He has authored numerous research papers for Reason Foundation, Heritage, and the Texas Public Policy Foundations, among others. So with that, I am going to pass it right over to you, Tom.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, to start with, would everyone please put their cell phones on mute? After all these Zoom meetings and GoToWebinar and Microsoft meetings, I've wanted to say that for months. Okay, slide 2. The report that I looked at, and you can see the title up at the top, I'm not going to read every sentence, every line, every word of every slide. I assume people who are here can read. That was done by WSP, which is a consulting firm formerly known as Williams Sales Partnership Limited. It is not the Washington State Patrol. And that was done for Washington State DOT on high-speed rail. However, they needed to come up with a different name so people would not think of California high-speed rail, which, as we will get into a little later, has been a disaster. In going over the report, we found incredible errors of every imaginable type, and we'll get into those, obviously. One of the biggest problems, however, right at the beginning is that WSP is very difficult to characterize as independent or unbiased. They, frankly, are in the business of doing whatever is necessary to get large projects approved and underway so they can get major contracts. They did a lot of that in California, and to date, the LA Times has identified they've gotten approximately $666 million of contracts, and it's barely started in construction. They've also been a sponsor of seminars on this program, so it's kind of hard to say that someone who pays to be a sponsor is independent. Let's go to slide 3. Again, many different types of problems with the report. Obvious inconsistencies.
Sounds like we're having a little bit of trouble with your cell phone there, Tom.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, sound good now, but you cut out right as you said the next slide, so I'd start from there.
Okay, we've had a number of problems with the report itself. There are major inconsistencies just from page to page, table to table. There are things in there, the data is just impossible. It just can't be done. There are projects that are cited as things that Washington should look at as a way to do it that have been terrible. The exhibit numbers don't even match. The page numbers are missing. Errors of this type. Look, I have been the partner in a major accounting and consulting firm. I've done hundreds of reports to clients. I've been a client in a major organization that received dozens of reports. I don't know how something like this gets out the door. Normally, the fact-checking, the proofreading, the editing is done to a fine degree by several levels, and generally at least 2 different partner-level people. And yet this is what we have. And we'll get into some of the details here. What we have, however, is a situation where if you just read the report, and anybody who knows the industry or knows the state can find so many obvious problems, what does that say about the things that you can't get into from what's in the report? The underlying data about things like costs, ridership modeling, what the route will be, etc. Okay, going on to slide 4, here's the first thing that jumps out at you. These are 2 schedules taken directly from the report. On the left, there is a map that clearly says that the places in green, including Vancouver and even North and West Vancouver, can be reached from Portland in 2 hours or less. Then on the right, there's a schedule from a few pages different that says it takes 2 hours and 45 minutes. How do you put out a report that contradicts itself when travel time and travel time saving is supposedly the main advantage of high-speed rail? And by the way, that 245, I don't see how it's going to happen. Moving on to slide 5, we have another table that purports to show the Cascadia Corridor population employment. Cascadia Corridor is their title for basically Portland to Vancouver, BC. Now, as you see on the table, the second thing on the list is Cascadia, and it is ranked second because it has the second highest employment of all of the metropolitan areas there. Now, this is terrible for 2 reasons. First of all, they are taking the Cascadia Corridor, which extends something like 310 miles of rail miles, against individual urbanized areas. This makes no sense. What should be compared here is not urbanized areas, but other rail corridors. Close together city pairs or groups of cities, not just individual cities. And that's why the population employment seems larger for Cascadia, because they're grouping 3 fairly large urbanized areas plus a few smaller ones along the way. Then we have the employment. Now, if you do some simple math, now I added the last column on the right as well as the row at the bottom. And we see that the Cascadia corridor, this very high employment, the second highest of this population, comes out to 72% of the population is employed. Well, this just can't be done. If you consider children that are still in school, people that are in college, even if they have a part-time job, that's not a full-time equivalent, and retirees, those who otherwise are unable or to work or just don't, they are actively engaged as housewives, which is one of the hardest jobs in the world. You just can't get anywhere near 72%. And in fact, the weighted average of all of the ones here is not even 50%. This is so high and so ridiculous. And also, by the way, is in conflict with other data in the same report. Guys, what are you trying to get away with here? This is obviously totally wrong, and you're trying to sell us a bill of goods. Let's shift now to California high-speed rail. And on slide 6, what we have in my state, I'm calling from Oakland, is a project that was not very good to start with and has been terribly managed. But California high-speed rail is by far the closest match to what is being proposed for you up in the Cascadia corridor. It's the same technology with the same promises. It is the same type of political environment, U.S. left coast, and it is much the same geography. We don't have a lot of flat land. Matter of fact, in California, we've got a lot more flat land than you do in the Cascadia corridor that you would be going through. And you have the same main consultant, WSP. Now, why did they come up with this term ultra high-speed ground transportation? Again, I think it's just so they had something other than high-speed rail so people would automatically think of California and our experience. Now, as you can see, the original authorizing legislation said could be in limited operation by 2008. The most current estimate, which is very questionable, is they might start testing in 2028 in the Central Valley, not exactly the most populated areas and those that would be most likely to use high-speed rail. There is no schedule for completing it. There is none. Okay, going on to slide 7, the original cost for the entire system, which included legs that would go to Sacramento and San Diego, not just San Francisco to Los Angeles and Anaheim, was for $45 million. We have no current budget for the entire system. They've given up even trying to estimate that. But for San Francisco, Los Angeles, the current estimate is now $80.3 billion, which is well over double their most recent estimate for that segment, which, by the way, is no longer valid. And the 80.3, very, very difficult to see how that could be possible. Then the entire plan was built around use of public-private partnerships. We're going to get the voters to approve $10 billion in bonds. They're going to get a lot of money from the federal government. I'll come back to that. But the big thing is we're going to have private investors who will be able to, the $1 billion a year of profit that this will be throwing off once it's operating, to issue bonds to pay for a major share of the construction. They've been trying for over a decade, and to date, they haven't had a single party step up and say, to build what you want to build, oh yeah, we're happy to do that, here's our money. Not one, nothing. Going on to slide 8. Most of what was expected and hoped for in high-speed rail funding from the feds just totally failed to appear. Obama was able to pass what turned out to be $8 billion as part of the ARRA program right after he was elected during the Great Recession. However, while several of the other states have dropped out entirely, and California has gotten a major share from those that dropped out, the total has worked out to, let's call it $3.5 billion. But the state has been so unsuccessful in meeting the requirements, namely having a plan to complete the whole thing and being able to complete the first segment on schedule, that the federal government and the current administration is a little bit less happy with both the concept of high-speed rail and the state of California in general, and I don't think I need to go into any detail there, that they have canceled the second grant for $900+ million and said, because you have not complied and we don't see how it can possibly, seriously considering clawing back $2.5 billion that we have already paid out. And we'll have to see where that goes. The current major funding source, and if they continue to build, this will be the major funding source, over half, is cap and trade. This is where a private party that wants to continue to emit greenhouse gases pays a fee to get a license. And the intention of this bill, when it was passed in 2006, was for those paying other greenhouse gases to reduce greenhouse gases.
Hey, Tom, there's another.
Yeah.
Tom, I hate to interrupt. There's another problem with your phone. Your audio cut out about 15 seconds ago, just after the greenhouse gases. So if you'd like to repeat from there.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So the intention with cap and trade was that the funds paid by those that didn't want to install the equipment to reduce their emissions would go to other people to fund them doing things that would reduce emissions. Instead, what has happened is it's going, and the target was to reduce the emissions by 2020, and obviously we're in 2020. So instead, it's going for high-speed rail construction, which actually emits a lot of greenhouse gases, as all major heavy construction does. And even if this actually is successful and the full system is up and operated, the emissions that would be reduced, best case, would be something like 0.3% of the total. And there is very, very real question if there will be any reductions at all. For example, the load factors that are assumed on high-speed rail are considerably higher than any other high-speed rail system anywhere in the world. And the main thing about energy efficiency, which means reducing greenhouse gases and other emissions, is you want to have the fullest loads possible on the train. You want to take away as many people who otherwise would be flying or who would be driving. Okay, let's go to slide 9, which is conclusions and recommendations. Main conclusion is obviously that this report is just not usable for any decision-making purpose. What should be done, if anybody wants to go forward with this, and of course there are a lot of people who do, is take a very good look at it. I went, frankly, from the very top, just what was visible from public documents. And I'm very scared at what little I was able to get out of what's further down. For example, I really didn't have any ability to look at what the route would be. When you're building high-speed rail, it has to be very, very straight. How you are going to do that through this corridor and all your hills and trying to get through metropolitan Seattle, which is over 70 miles of urbanized area, and keep that very straight and also pretty level without tunneling, I have no idea. And yet, unless you have a route, you don't know how much it's going to cost to construct it. And unless you have a route, how do you do ridership modeling? So this needs a lot of work to see if there's any credibility at all. And this work has to be done by somebody who is independent, who is not in a position to make millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or even billions of dollars if the project goes forward, but nothing if it doesn't. I can tell you from my own experience that there is much more money to be made by being in favor of cosmically stupid, multi-billion-dollar government transportation projects than being opposed to them. Whoever looks at it needs to be independent and viable, and then somebody actually has to read the report. Again, I don't think anybody at the state read the report. Otherwise, how could all of those errors be allowed to stand? And finally, keep in mind our experience in California. I and the other California taxpayers have paid a fortune to build your lessons learned book. Now, one last thing, go to the next slide, slide 10. This is from Washington State DOT website. There is a procurement now underway for the next consultant to keep this project going forward. Now go to slide 11. This is the project description from that document. And what I have highlighted there, I will read this. With previous studies having shown the operational viability and potential economic return to the area for development of such a line. In other words, relying upon this and other reports, this project is so essential it must be going forward. Coming soon to a state near you, unless it is stopped. Thank you. Ready for questions.
So, Tom, just to follow up on what you just read there, the previous study showing this economic viability claim that they make, what was the claim as far as as far as the economic impact for the region, for the Cascadia region, that they offered within the error-riddled study that you looked at?
Well, this report does not go into the economics in great detail itself. It mainly refers to other reports. Some of these are almost amusing. For example, there is a 2016 report from the Boston Consulting Group that looked at the connectivity of the major metropolitan areas and concluded that there was very little connectivity, and that Seattle was, Vancouver was more linked, I believe, to LA, and Seattle was more linked to Atlanta than each other. And the percentage of links going by LinkedIn data that they analyzed in both cases was well under 1%. And so the argument there was, we need to make these connections by having high-speed rail so that we can grow to the full potential. Now, if none of this, is there any mention of what we've learned over the last several months, namely that you can do one hell of a lot of connectivity without ever leaving your bedroom at home. And how are we working together now? And we are seeing estimates that work at home will go from 7% to 20% after we are done with our current health emergency, whenever that may be, and then grow from there. So part of the analysis is, with this new method of virtual mobility, do we really need physical mobility as much?
Good question. Here's a question from another Tom of KUOW-FM. What is your assessment of the wisdom of the Washington legislature continuing to pour money into more detailed study of the Cascadia high-speed rail corridor?
As I said before, I don't think it is wise at this time. Many, many things have changed since this report came out. In fairness, they did not foresee the COVID-19. I don't know anybody who did in any detail. So it's hard to hold them responsible for that. But now that it's happened, let's consider it. And to go forward to the next step without stepping back and saying, wait a minute, this report makes no sense. There are so many errors that we have to start over. It is just totally absent of credibility. And then we need somebody independent, not somebody who gets paid only if, well, the next paycheck is dependent on this should go forward.
You mentioned, and this is stated in the key studies, the key findings of the study as well, that there are some major key errors and misstatements made, and that in each case, the errors were always favorable to the pro side of moving the project forward. Is this something typical that you see in these kinds of reports, or does this report stand out in terms of its bias?
Well, unfortunately, it's very common. Now, I do have to make a correction. I was looking at the report last night. Go to slide 18, please, which will include the maps for the potential corridors. And again, while that's being set up, unfortunately, in this type of report, it is very common for this type of incredible over-optimism and confirmation bias and giving the client what they want to occur. And I've written on this many times before. Most recently, Jim Moore of USC and I did an analysis of the 2028 plan in Los Angeles, where they were going to build 28 major new transportation projects before the 2028 Olympics, which we found utterly unbelievable in many ways. I also did a report some years ago on the Honolulu rail system, which, by the way, Parsons Brinkerhoff, WSP, was promoting. And that, we said the economics and other things are just totally off base. Can't happen. They, of course, went ahead, and now it's in terrible trouble, and it has absolutely no plan to finish. Now, however, if you look at what's on slide 18, on the left side, those are the three corridors that were looked at in this report and in other reports. And as you can see, they all go through metropolitan Seattle. Some of them go through Seattle itself. Others go to the east side of Lake Washington. And that's going to be a wonderful problem to get into. Where do you put the line? Okay, now go to slide 19. Again, this is straight out of the report. There's the list of the stations for all of the corridors they studied from north to south. See anything missing? How do you put out a list of the major stations for this route and leave Seattle off it? Like I said, nobody read the report. You cannot have an error like this in a report that anybody has actually read with any intention of seeing if it made sense.
I want to remind everyone watching that you can download the report at washingtonpolicy.org. Katie, I'm sure, will put that link into the chat function so you could download it directly. And if you were a member of the media, in the press release you received, the link is there as well. Next question. Did this study review the amount of land that would have to be bought from private owners and development demolished? How are the costs figured, current market values versus using condemned market costs?
There isn't a great deal of detail on that. There is a cost estimate, and my understanding of that is it does include the costs of acquiring the parcels to build it. Now, this will vary quite a bit. If they can build on land that is already owned by government, particularly the state. And one example of that is sometimes used is you build it in a freeway median elevated. Now, that can save you on land. There's a lot of reasons to not do that. But if you do that and you save money on land, that's a cost savings, although there are often other costs that would go the other way. But there isn't a whole lot of detail in the report. There are some very, very tentative alignments, but these are very early, so it's just not something that you will see yet. And frankly, that's not at all uncommon in very early planning reports for mega projects of this type. And that's also one of the reasons why, as happened in California, they found out that they were going to have to buy several hundred more parcels than had been expected.
It's interesting to note that the opening of this report, the governor has a letter saying that basically this report is showing a great deal of promise for this project, that it shows the ease, basically, I mean, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but the ease with which this project could proceed and how it could transform Washington's and the Cascadia region's economy and way of life. But you note, as you've noted a number of times in this presentation, that there's major errors and omissions and misstatements here. I know you've gone through them, but not as a list. Just real quickly, can you just give us the top 5, the biggest errors or misstatements or omissions in this report that you think would provide, say, policymakers or citizens with the information they need to know why this report was unreliable?
Okay. Well, number one, there is not an adequate discussion of the incredible problems that come up when you are trying to do a mega project of this type. And California is one example of how bad it can possibly go. Instead, let me find the right page. Give me a moment. Go to slide 16. We have a statement here, again, right from the report, that what you should do is look at the Gordie Howe International Bridge from Detroit into Windsor, Canada, and the Channel Tunnel, the Channel, as good examples you should use. Well, the bridge is now scheduled for completion 11 years after its original date, and the cost is more than double. And they're still 4 years away from finishing. So God knows what could happen in that period. As to the channel, the capital costs were 80% over budget. The financing costs were 140%. It was supposed to make money. Instead, the loss was about $18 billion, and the ridership was far lower. And these are the projects that the report writers use as good examples to emanate. That's how bad it is. And I had extensive writing on how bad it gets, and it often gets in these types of projects. Okay. The ridership estimates are still preliminary, but they appear extremely high to me. Again, until you have a route, until you have a schedule, and things of that sort, it's very difficult to do it right. But I find the ridership estimates unbelievably low, high. I find the cost estimates high. I find the cost estimates understated very significantly. The difficulties in finding routes and being able to build a route that can maintain a 220 mile an hour top operating speed, unbelievable, particularly going through all the urban areas. The travel times also, as I've already pointed out, just don't make any sense at all. And I've given some detailed examples of how, even if the train was actually that fast, the travel estimates from origin to destination are unbelievable. I could go on, but I think that's enough for now.
One of the things you noted, let me just remind viewers, if you have a question, there's a question function in the toolbox there for GoToWebinar. It's on the right-hand side of your screen. Just enter your question there, and I'll get to it as soon as possible. One of the things you noted is that in this report from the state, it presented the idea of adding a lane in each direction to I-5, and that it would cost $195 million per lane mile. Is that a realistic? Did they look at adding lanes with any sense of realism or realistic expectations, realistic costs? What were some of the challenges that you saw in terms of how they were making that comparison and some of the problems with that comparison that they were making?
Well, go to slide 20. What I did, I saw that, and the first thing that we have to understand is nobody has ever suggested that I-5 should have 2 lanes added in each direction, one in each direction from Oregon to British Columbia. No one's ever made this. This is what? It's a straw man that is set up just so something can be compared to it, and that's so bad, ours is better. Well, on the left side, what I did is the higher one that shows the cost of 195 million a lane mile, I believe. This is the calculation of what it would cost if you took their estimate for the total cost, and this is from the director of Washington State DOT, and divided it by the number of lane miles, almost 200 million per lane mile. Then I took the cost of the interstate highway system and changed it to the same dollars, 2018 dollars, and I got 3 million per lane mile. So there's a difference of 65 times. Now, somebody wants to say, yes, but boy, if you're adding a lane to an existing highway, that's expensive. Yes, it is, particularly if you're doing it in an urbanized area. But to show what we have here, this kind of difference is ridiculous. The only backup they had in the report was a table that said, a narrative. It gave the example of the I-4 Ultimate project in Orlando, and what it says here is it's reconstructing 21 miles of highway at a price tag of $2.3 billion. Well, that is a project. What it doesn't say is that it's first far more than just adding lanes. Second, what it is adding is 2 lanes in each direction, so it's 84 lane miles. So if you divide the 2.3 billion through a dense, built-out, urbanized area, the total cost of the project is $27 million per lane mile in one of the most expensive possible corridors, and that includes many things that are not adding the lanes. It's other costs of redoing the entire highway as they're going along. And of course, if you're going to be building it in the Seattle metro area or Vancouver or Portland for that matter, or even going through Olympia and Everett and other places, yes, it's expensive in urbanized areas. But there is still a lot of land that this will be going through that's predominantly rural. and it's going to be nowhere near as expensive as in the urban areas. But again, this whole thing has no purpose other than to set up a straw man as a bad example. Now, on the right side, just for kicks, I said, okay, what are the outcomes? And when you're measuring human mobility, you measure it in passenger miles, one person going 1 mile. And what do you get? And guess what? Just in the Seattle urbanized area, which is 77 miles, if each lane mile was used as it's used today, only on working weekdays, 255 days a year, it would produce more than double the passenger miles of the entire high-speed rail line from Portland to Vancouver, 365 days a year in the out year when it is fully operational for decades. Again, somebody set up a straw man and assumed nobody would check it. I checked it.
What is in your appendix, you listed some failed mega projects in Washington State. What's the major lesson lawmakers and the public can take away from those failures and apply to new mega project proposals?
Well, if you listen to anything I say, listen to this. If you are starting a project, the very first thing you must have is some very experienced people who know the business. You want people with dirt on their boots and very lined faces from being out in the sun and the wind and the bad weather, who know how these things go. Then you need systems. You need control systems, from planning all the way through capital renewal and replacement. Instead, what happens is, when politicians approve a project, they want to move dirt. And when you do that, you wind up with projects that were out of control from day one, and no one knows it until the problems are so high that they can no longer be ignored. And unfortunately, I can give you list after list after list of projects that have been started by rookie agencies who've never done anything like that before, that have wound up being failures in every conceivable way.
How have ordinary citizens who've had concerns about California's high-speed rail engaged with policymakers to have their voice heard in that debate? What's worked and what hasn't as far as public involvement in keeping bad projects at bay?
Well, unfortunately, the primary way that the private people, private individuals, taxpayers, residents, whatever, have engaged is through legal action. There's been extensive public comment, etc., and the public comes in and says, we have this problem. And what happens is, thank you very much, your comment has been noted, and then the project gets approved. So what's wound up is litigation. And in the paper, I have a partial, and I say again, partial history of the lawsuits that have been filed, many of which are still underway. And I can guarantee you that there are many more still to come. And I don't see why it will be much different if someone tries this in the Oregon to British Columbia alignment. In fact, think about it. You now have 3 jurisdictions, states and provinces, in 2 countries that give you more opportunities to file lawsuits. And that means delay, cost, and some expensive compromises to try to keep the project going.
Next question comes from the audience. John, use the question function and the toolbar there for GoToWebinar. If any of you have a question, you can enter it there and do so very quickly because we're approaching the end. We're not there yet. This is from John. Insiders around Seattle know that a driving force in the development of this rail project is a local tech industry executive who's enamored with rail commuting, reaching into lower priced housing zones as a way of expanding the commute shed for Seattle area firms, making it really easy to commute from affordable housing in Skagit County or Thurston County into employment centers in Seattle and its near suburbs like Bellevue and Redmond. Comment on that vision, please.
Yes, that's very common. Besides the tech people who are behind it, and there's one very large firm centered in Washington that I don't think I need to name that has been one of the main sponsors, but also obviously the real estate developers have an interest in this. Okay, now there's a lot of tech industry in the Seattle area. We also have a little bit here in California, just south of me in Silicon Valley, as well as in San Francisco. What we have seen is major tech company after tech company saying, during COVID, everybody works at home. And then announcing, you know, this seems to be working pretty well. A lot of you never come back to the office. We have actually seen major companies who had made significant multi-million-dollar investments in new headquarter building walk away from the new headquarter building because the new working environment, particularly for tech, is going to be remote. And not only remote work, but remote learning, remote healthcare, remote shopping, of course, et cetera, et cetera. Now, obviously, there's a lot of jobs that can only be done in person, on the site, and we have to consider those. But a very large share of the jobs will no longer need physical transportation, and tech is near the very top of the list that will be transformed.
Next question is from audience member Daryl. It may be fair to compare California and Washington type projects, but the Eastern or Mid-America U.S. comparisons don't have a subduction zone or major fault lines that must be crossed. Were the fault lines that must be crossed considered?
The answer is yes, and I'm a CPA. I am not a structural engineer or anything remotely close, although I have worked with a number of them. From the rail projects I have worked on, and I was in charge of rich management, so I actually got into the details to some extent. I believe it is possible to design a rail system, including a tunnel, that can withstand an earthquake safely and, in most cases, actually be operational very shortly thereafter if it is done right. We actually have seen that in Los Angeles on what used to be called the Red Line, the subway there. It can be done. It is not cheap. And you need people who acknowledge the problem and know how to do it right. The other little problem you have, of course, is we are finding new earthquake faults all the time. And we probably always will. And unfortunately, the major way we find a lot of them is when there is an earthquake traced to a fault that no one knew existed before. So it is a problem. There are ways to get around it, even tunneling. But it's expensive, and it has to be done properly. Fire, life safety, and all that goes into has to be the number one priority once you get into construction and operation. Unfortunately, sometimes that is shortcutted.
Next question. This is dealing with carbon emissions. A push for the system seems predicated on carbon emissions reduction. Do you think growth in electric vehicles to replace standard vehicles will outpace the timeline of this proposed project?
Yes, it is. There's a couple of problems that need to be addressed. First of all, I think electric vehicles are a good thing, and I'm amazed at the progress that is being made, particularly in batteries. But there are a lot of things that need to be done, and one of these is, where does the power come from? And unfortunately, in my business, I often see, oh, let's electrify because that will get rid of the emissions. Well, where does the power come from? Well, in California, we're all for green power, except that means we've been shutting down the fossil fuel, which means we're buying 25% of our power from outside the state. Guess what it is, to a large new load, such as a new rail line that is operating during the peak, which is normally a summer weekday afternoon. That electricity has to come from somewhere. And if the hydro plants are going full out and you're getting as much as you can from wind and solar, and if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you've got a problem, then you have to go back to Old Faithful and burn something around it. And I think this deserves study, is siting wind farms remotely with CNG plants to share the distribution line to the users and run those windmills all night long to charge cars in the garage overnight. Now, if you can do that, that can be an incredibly productive and cost-efficient way of getting to electric cars. And so we're too early to know how this is going to pencil out. There's a lot of good ideas that I've heard and I think are deserving of follow-up by people who are really experts in the field, rather than people like me who have read a little bit and asked a few questions and been to a seminar or two. But until we understand that the system will work, we should be reluctant before we make major commitments to convert to the system.
Looks like we have time for maybe two questions left. This is from John in the audience. Tom, follow up on long distance commuting. Sure, more telecommuting, but what if office time returns as a need, as specialists like me are predicting? What's seen as coming by specialists is only part-time telework by and large, still coming in on half or more workdays for meetings, etc. Talk about billions on long distance high-speed rail just for commuting.
Yeah, this is one of the great questions, and right now there are a lot of researchers that are trying to figure this out. The big movement that we are going to see for most workers is not 5 days a week telecommuting, but 2, 3, 4 days a week telecommuting and 1 day still to the office. Well, if this means that somebody can find the house that they've always wanted in a distant suburb, and they're driving in 1 or 2 days a week, what's the net change? And I've been working with people, and we have been doing as much research as we can. And right now, there is not a whole lot in the literature that gets into this. So we instead are being forced to do things like surveys and modeling. And unfortunately, the surveys are stated choice surveys because we can't do revealed choice very well yet. So this is a big question. It's a very valid question to ask and a concern. And like I say, this is something that should be studied closely. I am hoping that the result will be a significant net reduction. Hoping. I'm not predicting. I'd like to see it come out that way, but let's see what the data and the analysis shows. And then let's see if we can pilot it and see what else happens. But overall, particularly in the tech sector, where we're seeing not 3 days or 4 days a week, 4.7 days a week work at home, to come in once every 3 or 4 weeks, then I think you've got a pretty clear picture that there will be some major gains. Gains in reduction of greenhouse gas and energy use. What I would like to see, if we're going to have government policy, let's support distance working, distance learning, etc. For example, how about changing the tax code so if the employer supplies the equipment, supplies the high-speed internet connection, even some money for an office so someone can work at home, that's deductible to the employer but is not taxable income to the employee, even if some of that is used for personal use. That's something I think the government could do that would have a positive impact very quickly.
Okay, I'm just going to wrap it up with one final question for you, Tom. And that is, what are the essential pieces of information or the essential questions a policymaker would need to know about this state report to avoid coming to the conclusion of the introductory letter from the governor and saying that, hey, this report kind of proves that this project is feasible. It's not only possible, but it's, it promises all these benefits. What do they need to know? What are the questions that they need to ask to really get a sense of what this report really says?
Well, the essential question boils down to what independent body of experts who have no skin in the game have reviewed this and have largely agreed with the conclusions. Absent of that, hand it back and say thank you for your promotional brochure. Be sure to come back to me when you have something that I can look at from somebody independent. But we have everything from what are the costs going to be? Where is the alignment going to be? Is it going to be on the west side of Lake Washington and hit Seattle, or on the east side and hit Bellevue? And if I'm on the wrong side, how do I get to high-speed rail to make it worth using for me? The costs, how long is it going to take? What is the projected ridership? And what happens if things don't turn out? This is a project where before you can get any feedback on how well it's being used, and how well the promises are being fulfilled, you've got to build the whole damn thing. That's a very, very large risk. And again, look at California for experience.
Well, you raise a tremendous number of issues that should be addressed by policymakers. We think there's big questions about this report. The taxpayers are spending it looked like upwards of somewhere close to $1 million on this kind of report. So that's an expensive promotional brochure. And I think that people deserve better and better information. Thanks so much for the study, Tom, and your time here. I'm sure if we get additional questions, we'll forward those to you from members of the media, and we'd be happy to take those. I thank everyone here for registering and giving us your time this afternoon. We want to honor that time. Tom, thanks again for being available for Washington Policy Center.
My pleasure, anytime. And again, anybody who has a question, please send them into Washington Policy Center, and I'll be happy to get back to you as best I can.
Thank you so much, and thank all of you for attending. And please watch for upcoming events at washingtonpolicy.org, our events section. We're always updating with new virtual events, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.